If you switch on a screen today, any screen at all, you are greeted by the same hypnotic sequence replayed on an endless loop. Rotors slicing the air, dark silhouettes fast roping from helicopters, grainy night vision footage of armed men moving with rehearsed precision, a Latin American capital framed as a stage for spectacle, and a familiar chorus of anchors and analysts breathlessly narrating what they insist is history in the making, describing decisive leadership, democratic restoration, bold action, the choreography of power examined from every flattering angle, and while the talking heads argue over approval ratings, legal theories, and tactical execution, they are doing what they always do, keeping your eyes fixed on the performance so you never glance behind the curtain where the real transaction is taking place, because what unfolded in Venezuela today was not driven by ballots or constitutions or sudden moral awakenings. It was not fundamentally about saving a people or even about Nicolas Maduro as a person. It was about numbers flashing red on balance sheets, about alarms ringing quietly in financial rooms far from Caracas, about a margin call issued not by voters but by markets, and to grasp why the United States accepted the staggering risk of deploying force in South America, you do not need to consult opinion polls or legal textbooks. You need to look instead at a dry, terrifying data set that almost never leads the news, the state of America's energy reserves and the monetary architecture that depends on them. Because for years, the United States has been quietly draining its emergency oil stockpiles, tapping what was meant to be the nation's last line of defense, not for war or catastrophe, but to massage gasoline prices and suppress visible inflation, selling strategic reserves to buy short-term political calm, pawning the inheritance to pay this month's bills, and as a result, those reserves now sit at levels not seen since the early Reagan era, hollowed out just as the world grows more unstable. And all of this is happening while the deeper pillar of American power, the dollar's role as the compulsory medium of global oil trade, is visibly cracking as old agreements fray, as major producers flirt with alternatives, as new blocs test settlements in currencies that do not pass through New York, slowly eroding the artificial demand that has propped up American deficits for half a century, and then, as if to crystallize the danger, whispers began circulating through trading floors and intelligence briefings that Venezuela, sitting atop the single largest proven oil reserves on the planet, was preparing to formalize a break from the dollar system to sell its oil not in greenbacks, but in a basket of currencies aligned with the emerging multipolar order. And that whisper was not noise, it was the line in the sand. Because the United States can tolerate many challenges, but it cannot easily survive the moment when the world's biggest oil tank disconnects from its monetary grid, since such a move would drain demand for U.S. debt, spike interest rates, and expose the fragility of an economy built on perpetual borrowing. So faced with that prospect, Washington confronted a stark choice: adapt to a new reality through negotiation and reform, or deploy the one instrument it still commands without debate, force, and it chose force, which is why what we witnessed was not liberation, but liquidation, a foreclosure carried out with rifles instead of paperwork, the seizure of collateral dressed up as humanitarian concern, the return of gunboat diplomacy wearing modern branding, and in cutting through the noise, we can see that the raid itself was never the point. The point was the reason beneath it, the cold arithmetic that has turned military power into an extension of financial enforcement, revealing how the slow death of the petrodollar has transformed soldiers into collectors and battlefields into balance sheets, and why a tactical success in Caracas may ultimately accelerate the strategic unraveling of American monetary dominance. Because this conflict is not about votes, it is about barrels. And to appreciate the ferocity of the move, You have to examine the American balance sheet stripped of comforting myths. The story sold for years that shale made the United States energy independent, that it no longer needed foreign oil or foreign entanglements. A story that was at best a half-truth, and in geopolitics, half-truths are lethal, because while the U.S. does pump enormous volumes of oil, much of it is light, sweet crude ill-suited to the aging refineries that power its industrial base, refineries designed decades ago to process heavy, sour crude from places like the Middle East and Venezuela, creating a structural mismatch that economists gloss over, an economy that produces champagne but runs its engines on diesel, a mismatch long solved by imports from cooperative partnerships that are now fraying as Saudi Arabia asserts its own interests, curbs output, ignores Washington's calls, and edges closer to alternative blocs, leaving the U.S. with a simple but brutal problem. It needs a specific kind of oil to function, and it is running out of easy suppliers, a problem compounded by the reckless depletion of the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, which was meant for existential emergencies but was instead used to blunt political pain, leaving the emergency tank dangerously low, just as global tensions rise and supply routes look increasingly fragile, forcing planners to scan the map for heavy crude sources they could actually access, finding Canada maxed out, Russia hostile and sanctioned, the Gulf unreliable, until only one massive reservoir remained within theoretical reach, the Orinoco Belt. And for years, Washington tried every non-military lever to unlock it: sanctions, diplomatic pressure, parallel governments, economic strangulation, but the oil either stayed underground or leaked eastward through opaque channels to China. And as the risk of a price shock loomed, with $150 oil threatening to tip an already fragile U.S. economy into crisis, the calculus changed from containment to control, from influence to possession, explaining the sudden shift in tone, the abrupt abandonment of talks, the transformation of handshakes into fists once reserve levels crossed a critical threshold, revealing that the operation was never about Venezuelans but about barrels, a hostile takeover timed precisely as markets trembled and refill options vanished. Because Washington could not afford to buy that oil at market prices and could not afford to let a rival secure it, so it moved to create a supplier it could dominate, a new client state carved out by force, an act as cynical as it is risky, effectively turning the U.S. military into armed security for the energy balance sheet. Yet this maneuver carries a devastating side effect, because while it may ease physical shortages briefly, it broadcasts a message to every resource-rich nation watching that refusal to comply with dollar rules invites coercion, a message that does not inspire loyalty but flight, accelerating the search for alternatives, because the true bullet here is currency, not oil. And in the post-gold world, the dollar's value rests on a decades-old bargain that mandated oil sales in dollars, forcing global demand for U.S. currency and enabling limitless deficit spending, an exorbitant privilege that funded American prosperity by exporting inflation abroad, a system now visibly unraveling as more states experiment with non-dollar trade. And Venezuela represented a potential tipping point, a proof of concept that vast resource wealth could exist outside the American banking orbit, an existential threat from Washington's perspective. Because if China can buy oil without dollars, it no longer needs to hoard U.S. debt. And if that debt is dumped, the consequences at home would be immediate and severe. So the seizure of Caracas was a desperate attempt to plug a widening crack, to reinstall a government that would repeg, reprice, and reopen the fields to Western majors, forcing oil back into the dollar system at gunpoint, a move that exposes profound weakness rather than strength, because genuine hegemony rests on attraction, on offering the best terms and the most trusted currency, while coercion signals decline, turning leadership into enforcement and markets into battlegrounds, creating a prisoner's dilemma for every other nation with valuable resources, warning them that exit carries punishment, yet this strategy contains its own doom, because force cannot be scaled indefinitely. Alliances like BRICS are too large, de-dollarization too far advanced, and by acting so openly, the United States has validated every critique leveled against it, sacrificing trust for short-term control, transforming convenience into danger, making dollar holdings feel like liabilities rather than assets, converting a trade system into a hostage situation, and history suggests hostage takers rarely emerge unscathed. So while helicopters will eventually lift off, and headlines will fade, and markets may even celebrate briefly at the promise of cheaper oil, the deeper damage to the international order is irreversible, because by tearing away the mask of principle and acting as a pirate scraping the barrel, the United States has undermined decades of moral narrative, rendering its lectures on sovereignty hollow. And in doing so, it has not saved the dollar, but hastened its decline, spooking allies as much as adversaries, pushing wealthy states to seek refuge in assets beyond reach, tightening rival alliances, hardening divisions into a stark West versus rest dynamic in which the West finds itself numerically and materially disadvantaged, and while oil may flow north for a short time, influence and legitimacy drain away, leaving this moment to be remembered not as a triumph, but as an admission of exhaustion, the day the emergency lever was pulled in full view of the world, signaling that the era of effortless dominance is over, that the petrodollar spell is broken, and that beneath the spectacle of power lies a system struggling to keep itself afloat as the center of gravity shifts beyond its grasp. And yet the story does not end with the seizure of territory or the installation of friendly signatures on contracts, because the aftermath is where empires are truly measured. And as the dust settles, the contradictions begin to multiply, stacking pressure on a system already strained to its limits, because occupation, whether acknowledged or denied, carries costs that cannot be waved away by press conferences or short-term market rallies. Costs measured not only in dollars, but in credibility, logistics, and time, and every additional day that American power is visibly entangled in enforcing an economic outcome rather than offering a competitive one reinforces the lesson the rest of the world is already learning, that dependence on a single financial axis is no longer safety, but vulnerability. And while policymakers in Washington may believe they have bought themselves breathing room by forcing oil flows back into familiar channels, they have simultaneously accelerated the clock on alternatives, because capital is not loyal, it is pragmatic. And nothing terrifies capital more than unpredictability backed by force. So sovereign wealth funds quietly rebalance. Central banks discreetly diversify reserves, bilateral trade deals bypass traditional clearing systems, and the slow bureaucratic work of building parallel infrastructure gains new urgency, all of it invisible on nightly news, but relentless in its cumulative effect. And as this happens, the domestic consequences begin to surface as well, because a currency that relies on coercion abroad eventually demands sacrifice at home, whether through higher borrowing costs, reduced living standards, or political instability born of unmet expectations. And the public, conditioned for decades to believe in limitless capacity and painless dominance, will struggle to reconcile rhetoric with reality when the bill arrives, because inflation is not just a number, it is a social force, eroding trust, amplifying division, and exposing fault lines that were once papered over by cheap credit and imported stability. And in that sense, the raid on Caracas is less an endpoint than a signal flare, illuminating the transition from an era where the United States could set the rules to one where it must enforce them. A transition that history shows is rarely smooth or bloodless, because systems built on privilege do not surrender it gracefully. They cling, they tighten, they overreach, and each overreach teaches the rest of the world how to adapt, how to insulate, how to cooperate without the old center. So while the immediate narrative will focus on control regained and order restored, the deeper narrative is one of acceleration, of momentum shifting beneath the surface, of a global economy quietly reconfiguring itself in response to fear as much as opportunity. And this is why today matters beyond headlines and footage, because it marks another step in the long unwinding of a post-war arrangement that depended on consent more than compulsion, an arrangement now being stress-tested in real time. And as viewers, we are invited to celebrate or condemn the spectacle. But the more important task is to recognize the pattern, to see how power behaves when it senses decline, how it reaches for tools that once guaranteed success without acknowledging that the environment has changed, and how each such move narrows rather than expands its options, because trust, once lost, is almost impossible to reclaim, and trust is the invisible currency that underpins all others. So as the world absorbs what has happened and recalculates accordingly, one conclusion becomes unavoidable, that even if this operation secures resources in the short term, it has revealed a deeper insecurity, and in doing so, it has pushed the global system one step closer to a future where dominance is fragmented, currencies compete, alliances shift fluidly, and no single power can unilaterally dictate terms without consequence, a future already taking shape not through declarations but through quiet decisions made in ministries, boardrooms, and trading desks, far from the sound of helicopters, decisions that will define the next era long after today's images fade from the screen.